Well, good afternoon and good morning to those of you that are on the West Coast. Today's webinar, my name is Rob Schuster, and I'll be presenting today's webinar on best practices for workplace violence prevention and management. So it looks like we are right on time, so let's begin because we have a lot of ground to cover today. In general, the overview for the program in our next hour is I want to start by just giving you some basic objectives for what I want to accomplish in this session. I should say that this is going to be an overview session. None of these areas I'm going to get into too much specific detail on. For example, my last webinar was on high-risk termination protocols specifically. So that's mentioned in this, but it's just a component of an overall workplace violence program. So we won't be going into too much detail on any of these areas, but I want to start with the objectives. We'll talk about critical mistakes that companies will make when dealing with workplace violence issues, or I should say when not dealing with workplace violence issues and pretending that they will never happen. There's a real significant importance in human resource folks working with security personnel. I know those are separate departments, but they really in these matters have to work together for the purpose of early recognition and for properly handling these cases. It takes the expertise and the resources of both departments working together to have an effective plan. We're going to talk about the development of your workplace violence policy, a policy that has to have certain criteria in it. And it should revolve around your response to a concept that is known as reasonable foreseeability. That is and it's a bit of a fuzzy concept, but it is what typically is the question at hand in either a courtroom proceeding or a compliance proceeding for OSHA or some other government regulatory body. They're talking about the reasonable foreseeability that a particular event that may have happened in your workplace, could you have foreseen that, and did you do anything about it to either prevent it or make adaptations or make arrangements for how you're going to respond? So that policy has to address that. We'll talk about what actually workplace violence has come to be known as. There are some people's perception that it's only internal. It's not. There are external sources, so we'll look at the different categories as they have been defined by various bodies that regulate or look to police workplace violence, OSHA being one of them. We'll talk about employee training, and I will tell you that any policy, any prevention program, anything that you have to address this phenomenon of workplace violence will not be of optimum use until you get every employee trained, until they all become your eyes and ears. And we'll get into the details of why that's true. Specifically, what they're looking for, those behavioral warning signs. Because these things don't happen in a void, and they don't happen all of a sudden. Typically, there have been some warning signs that are developmental in the process and could have been seen and reported. We'll talk about the case management team, the importance of having a case management team to take advantage of the collective wisdom that you have in your organization, as well as external resources that are that are available to you to help with some of these situations. We're going to talk about, and I'll have a summary on the high-risk termination protocols, because many of these workplace violence incidents, the more serious ones especially, revolve around a termination or a termination that has happened in the past and perhaps wasn't handled exactly the way it should have been, and there is an absolute desire, an absolute fixation on coming back with revenge in mind. We'll talk about third-party assistance that may be required, not just for terminations, but in counseling you on how to handle some of these cases, because they're all not always black and white. We'll get into protective measures and response actions that you can take so that you're prepared not only to help prevent these occurrences, but if one were to happen, and they're not all absolutely preventable, but if one were to happen, are you prepared to respond? We'll talk about one of the most extreme of the workplace violence incidents being active shooters? And do you have specific response plans that address that unique and that lethal a situation? Because they're unlike any other situation, to include any other armed confrontation like armed robbery or a hostage taking. Motivations are different, the tactics are different, so your response plans need to be different. Then we'll talk about documentation of the process, and I'll offer some training resources. So in terms of what I'd like to accomplish today in this hour that we have, I want to make sure that we have a good definition of the scope of the problem, and to give you the tools or the components so that you can design a prevention and response strategy that will give you some, and though it is defensible in court, that's not your primary objective. I will tell you this repeatedly. Your primary objective should be to do the right thing for your people. Businesses say all the time our most valuable asset is our personnel. And people listen to things like that, and then they look to see what you're doing to protect them, to put some substance behind that quote. So not only does your plan need to be defensible in court, but it needs to be the right thing for your employees. What kinds of activity are often included as workplace violence? We're going to talk about the whole scope of those things that could be considered and will be evaluated as workplace violence incidents. What should employees be alert for? I said before, and you'll hear me say it several times today, that your plan isn't going to do you much good if every employee doesn't know what to look for, number one, and number two, how to report it. And it's not just a good idea to report it, but it's a requirement. And then finally, I want you to be able to look at, I'm going to give you some guidelines for the prevention and for individual case management. So at the end of this session, you should be able to have kind of the overall structure of what a good workplace violence prevention and reaction plan should be. Let's talk about critical mistakes. The first and foremost that many companies are still, and I'm seeing less and less, companies are receiving their wake-up calls, but I still see denial. I still see problem avoidance, sweeping things under the rug, pretending they don't happen, making excuses, or delaying response to a validly reported incident, or at least a condition that's been reported. And I will tell you that the cost of doing that is that if you do have a problem, and if it's been reported, you probably have one, it will not go away by itself. The people will not just work it out. It's going to get worse. When these reports are talking about aggressive behavior, it's only going to get worse if you don't address it. And sometimes addressing it in a counseling type of a manner is all that it takes. But don't let that won't happen here, we're just like family. Don't let that mindset keep you from doing what's best for your business and for your employees. Don't think that, well, we're too small of an organization for this to really impact us. It has impact on every business, small, medium, or large. If you have never, ever had an employee argument, if you have never had an employee fired, if you've never had a domestic situation that evidences itself in your workplace, if you've never had an employee relationship develop and then go badly in your workplace, if you've never had that, or if you've never had a disgruntled customer, if none of those things have ever happened to you, then maybe you don't have to deal with workplace violence. But I doubt that that's the case for any company. So don't stay in that denial mode. Have a plan. Have some way of addressing this. And if you don't get total workplace participation or workforce participation, you're going to have a less than effective plan. You have to get all employees involved, because for the most part, when things start, they start at the base level, and they start amongst the employees, and they don't necessarily get shared with supervisors. They aren't necessarily observed by all supervisors, and if the whole workforce isn't involved, you're going to miss those key elements in the behavioral red flags that we're going to talk about in this session. Not having a threat response plan or a case management team in place. Not having a case management team in place doesn't afford you that collective wisdom in evaluating these cases. It often leads to the next mistake, which is an insufficient assessment process or an insufficient investigation. You sometimes rely on the opinion of a single supervisor, and though that person may be a very competent person, it helps to use that collective wisdom. And that can also lead to your acting too hastily. All too often I've heard managers, I've heard bosses say, well, just fire the guy. That'll be the end of our problem. Acting too hastily, number one, the termination could not be founded on good solid ground. And number two, if it's done in a manner that is contrary to the protocols that we're going to talk about today in terms of high-risk terminations, it may become an even bigger problem once that person leaves your employ. So those are some of the critical mistakes you want to avoid. It's very important that human resources and security work together. Obviously, human resources play an important role from hiring to firing, and that is true even relative to workplace violence. They are involved in pre-employment screening, in all employee training, and this just needs to be another category of employee training with input from security. There needs to be discrete communication channels. Those are usually arranged by HR, but security sometimes, and if you jump down to one of the lower bullets there, you'll see that reports will come into both. Employees will report things that they think security should know about that are workplace violence related, and they'll also report things that to HR because that's who they're comfortable with. And those two groups need to work together to get the full benefit, again, of having an organizational approach to this problem. Obviously, the HR folks run the employee assistance programs, and that can be part of the solution. Both of these entities within your organization are going to have different resources externally. They'll have people to lean on and whose opinion you could really value and help you work your way through this problem. But if the two aren't talking to each other, then you're not getting the full benefit of that network. And again, finally, termination, while it may become necessary, if it's not handled right, it may not be the end of a problem. It may be the beginning of a bigger one. And that's a concept you really need to understand, and we'll drive home a little more later on. In developing your written workplace violence policy, it is important that it be written. It can't just be an understood thing. It can't just be general good behavior guidelines that are understood by all. It has to be in writing. And employees need to be trained on it as part of their in-processing or their onboarding. They should be trained on it on a periodic basis with acknowledgement forms that they understand it and are going to comply with it. It should be a no tolerance policy. And that's more difficult to do than just to say. It is hard to implement a no tolerance policy when perhaps the problem, the person that has the problem is a very key player in your organization. This cannot be applied when it's convenient. Caution regarding narrow definitions. I would say that I'd rather have a broader scope definition with broader behavior examples of what inappropriate behavior is than too narrow a scope of definition. We'll get into definitions in our next slide. But I've seen several different definitions. OSHA's put out definitions of workplace violence. The association, or the American Society of Industrial Security, has put out, in conjunction with Society of Human Resource Professionals, SHRM, they have put out a joint document in 2011, I believe, in September, and they had a definition for workplace violence, but they should be fairly all-encompassing. We'll look at some examples, and I'll tell you what the components should be in a good definition. You need to spell out the reporting And that's important. Reporting requirements, not good ideas, not we'd like you to. It's a reporting requirement for all of what they see and how to report it, and that be documented. Because this is going to have legal implications whether an incident happens or not. Speaking of those legal implications, I said before that it is probably going to be, this is a standard that's going to be used, whether it's for compliance in terms of OSHA. And I should mention that let me go back a slide. I mentioned OSHA. They have the general duty clause, which is what workplace violence is covered with in terms of providing a safe work environment. But they've also written two directives, one in September of 2011 and one in May of 2015. The one in September of 2011, that dealt more specifically with what they identified as three high-risk industries, if you will: healthcare, social services, and late-night retail. And they wrote specific guidelines in terms of helping those industries on good ideas. That's not a bad document to look at, whatever your industry is, because there was some pretty good guidance, and it gives you an idea of what OSHA is going to be looking at. That particular directive talked about how their inspectors are going to come in the case of a report. Their second publication in May of 2015, that was entitled Guidelines for Prevention of Workplace Violence in those in healthcare and social service industries. But again, it was a very good document that gave some pretty good guidelines in terms of workplace violence policy. So back to your legal stance, you're going to be judged, whether it's OSHA or the courts, you're going to be judged by, did you meet the standard of reasonable foreseeability? And that's kind of a gray area, but basically it says, given this incident that happened, could you have reasonably foreseen that something like that could have happened at your facility or in the work environment that this person occupies, because it's your business? This is really what's going to shape the scope of what you have to prepare for, because this is what you're going to be evaluated by. And it shapes what data to collect so that you can recognize your potential for a workplace violence hazard. And I'm talking about your industry-specific history, what's happened to other companies within your same industry. Is there a history within your company of aggression or violent behavior? What is the crime at your location? Crime statistics in the neighborhood. These are the things that, because it's not always internal workplace violence, we'll talk about external workplace violence as well. So you have to do your homework in this concept of reasonable foreseeability. What types of things might, not probably will, but have a remote possibility of happening? And have you made some allowances to either prevent those things, some safeguards, or at least planned a response to them? This is not only your legal requirement to protect against negligence, but it's your responsibility to your workforce. So let's talk about the definition in your policy. There's one definition I've read, I think it's a little too general, but any conduct that creates an intimidating, hostile, offensive, or threatening working environment through unwelcome words, actions, or physical contact. That's not bad. OSHA's definition, you can read it there: violent acts directed towards persons at work or on duty. And that includes physical assaults or threats of assaults. And then the other document that I mentioned that was put out by As-Is and SHRM has this definition that you can read. It's a little more all-encompassing: a spectrum of behaviors including overt acts, threats, and other conduct that generates a reasonable concern for safety from violence, where a nexus exists between the behavior and the physical safety of employees and others, on-site or off-site when related to the organization. And it defines others as customers, clients, or business associates. Now, here's what I feel is necessary in a good definition. It needs to address acts or the threat of violence. It needs to address violence or aggression. I use that pretty liberally, but aggressive behavior is the first step towards violence. It's part of the the red flag behaviors. So it needs to address disproportional aggression in the workplace. It should, as this one does, talk about on-site as well as off-site when related to the organization, whether it's a special event sponsored by the company or the organization, or whether it's, as in social service workers, going out into the field and engaging with the public as part of their job. And there are a lot of industries where that happens. That's workplace violence, whether it happens in your building or not. And it should also deal with no tolerance. Again, difficult to enforce, but it's a must. And finally, it should have a clause in there about no retaliation against those who report such behavior. If it has those components, then I'd say it's a pretty complete definition. So let's get into the types of things that are considered workplace violence, both by the courts and OSHA. They're not always internal, though that's what people typically have in their mind when they're talking about workplace violence. It's not always internal. External sources are just criminal activity from non-employees and possibly even non-customers, but just criminal activity that works, that operates, or that unfolds inside your work environment, wherever that is. It can also be customer or client-related violence. How many people are in a customer service situation where they may have to deal with an angry-looking gentleman like you see on the lower right? And how do you do that? How is it that you can, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but this is included in potential workplace violence. On the external, or on the internal side, and this is the more traditionally thought of, it's that violent engagement from one employee to another. Or it is an employee's personal relationship, a domestic relationship, that spills over into the workplace. And believe me, if it's happening at home or if it's happening in their living environment, it's going to spill over into the workplace, because the natural progression of events is the spouse will get restraining orders to keep them away from the other victim spouse at the home or at the living area. And what's the next logical place that the abusive spouse is going to look for this, for their victim? At work, because they know where they are. They know they're there. So it's going to happen. It's going to unfold in your hallway or in your facility eventually. You cannot just deny, well, that's not a business-related problem. It will become so. Individual terminations, obviously, is a big driver of some of these things, for the reason being revenge. Now, there's a lot you can do to affect that person's total desire and total fixation on getting revenge, and that's in how you do the termination. And then finally, in a related category, the facility closings, RIFs, where people are perhaps terminated without cause, just because of circumstance. These are usually the drivers of internally motivated workplace violence, and that's what's more typically thought of when you're talking about this phenomenon, but it encompasses the external as well. Whether it's internal or external, the first step in any plan, once you've defined it, and once everybody understands what it is and what it includes, is that everyone needs to understand what it looks like, what it means to your organization, and what their responsibilities are to notice it and to report it. So you have to educate all employees at a particular, I'd say, level 1 type of class, where you're educating the workplace on what it is and to recognize the behavioral warning signs, which we're going to get into in the next slides. And this isn't profiling, by the way. We're not profiling anybody. We're talking about behaviors, not the individual, but the individual's behavior. These are warning signs. And then what if they see these things? What are they supposed to report? The fact that they have to report it. It's not just a good idea, it's a requirement. To who or to whom do they report it, and what are the discrete channels that are available to them if they're a little shy about doing so? And depending on the intimidation factor, they might be very shy about doing so. So that's important to have various channels that can be discrete. The next level of training is the supervisory level, because now what does the supervisor do when they're the ones that receive this report? Not only do they have to be observant themselves, but it's not likely they're going to be the first ones to see it. They will be the first ones maybe to have it reported to them. So discrete reporting strategies, and then they have to seek the help of HR and security. And then finally, the next level of training required is the case assessment team. That is, what are the case management options and the use of professional assistance, and those options could be anything from verbal or written warnings and putting the person on an improvement plan, to probation, to counseling, to suspension, to termination, but it should be well supported and a result of the collective wisdom of the group. So what are the behavioral warning signs that you want to teach everyone to be alert for? You probably have seen this list before, but let's review it. Number one, I have said it before, violence is not an event, it is a process. And that process can be recognized at its earlier stages when people just don't snap. It's usually not an isolated act. There are things that people can see that are out of character that should be reported to maybe give this person some help. Sometimes these red flag behaviors are silent cries for help. If you don't, the elevation of the behavior will continue. Now this evaluation, again, is not profiling, and it's important that the reporting channels be discreet, because the behavior can be intimidating. And if you don't have a discreet reporting channel, people aren't going to want to do it. And obviously we've already talked about the dangers of denial and delaying action. But some of those specific problem behaviors are the verbalized support of violence as a solution. People are in a break room watching television, or they're talking about a particular event that has been televised regarding workplace violence, and somebody makes the comment, well, that guy knew how to take care of business. Well, that's just an inappropriate comment, and those kind of things, they can't just be ignored. So a verbalized support of violence as a solution, saying I'm going to do such and such to so-and-so, that shouldn't be spoken, and that needs to be reported if it is. A total inability to resolve problems with coworkers. If a particular person has a history of any confrontational conversation, or even any opposing conversation ends up in a shouting match or a finger pointing, gesture pointing shouting match, that's inappropriate. That needs to be addressed. There sometimes is a history of even more aggressive behavior. Now, take a look at this photograph for a minute. Aggressive or threatening behavior. I'm assuming from this photograph that the person on the left that's standing and leaning over and shouting at this gentleman is the aggressor we're talking about. But I want you to ask yourself is this: how long do you think that guy's going to take this abuse? Maybe this has happened for years. Maybe this has happened, well, maybe not for years, but for months or weeks. And at what point in time is that gentleman who's seated going to say, just I've had it, and going to act out himself? Now, if you have a zero tolerance or a no tolerance policy, and there's even a pushing match or a scuffle that results, that is the explosive culmination of months and months and months of taking this abuse. Whose fault is that? Can you really blame that gentleman for just having enough and acting out? Well, if you allow it to continue, if it doesn't get reported, and this is a supervisory tactic that continues, believe me, the company is at fault. Now, this will probably end up in the termination of both people if it ended up being a physical altercation. And is that fair? No. So it needs to be addressed in its early stages when you have this kind of a problem, and most people are tolerating it to a point. So just understand that. If you have substance abuse in your workplace, well, maybe it's not happening in the workplace. I guarantee you, though, it will manifest itself in the workplace. The effects of that substance abuse will eventually show up in your workplace. Signs of emotional distress, sudden drastic mood changes or mood swings. explosive outbursts. I mean, somebody just blows up in the face of someone or on the telephone, disproportional to the severity of the incident that they're talking about, or to the condition that they're talking about. Sudden absences or decreased productivity. Those things, they need to be noticed. All of a sudden, this person who was a pretty stellar employee is not such. Their work is falling off. They just seem to be depressed. Perhaps there's even a deterioration of their hygiene and self-care. They look like, they're just totally at wit's end, and it's, like the world is coming down on them. This is a person that's looking for help, doesn't know how to ask for it, and maybe their behavior, inappropriate behavior, is a way of asking for it indirectly. I've also heard obsession or fascination with weapons, violent movies, fighting, or other violent events. Now, I'm just not talking about the ordinary weapon enthusiast. I'm talking about somebody who identifies with violence as a way to solve problems. They have an absolute obsession with guns, with killing, with firearms, and they make no bones about it in their conversations. That's what dominates their conversation, to a point that people are uncomfortable around them. This can be a behavioral warning sign. Inferences or threats that are direct or indirect. Bullying is what it's known as in the workplace usually. Bullying in the workplace is a very real problem. Most people don't recognize that they have it until it's too late. It can be very subtle, but bullying can come in many forms, and if it's not addressed, it will get worse. And it's not a tactic that is effective for very long, and it will, if the bully is accepted, if the bully's behavior is not addressed, that person assumes, well, I guess it's okay, and they will continue, and it will get worse. So it has to be addressed early. And inattention to rules, resistance to authority. And this is especially when it develops over time. This person wasn't always this way. Now they're becoming so. They're more and more disgruntled. That is evidence of a developing situation that should be addressed. Chronic grievances, the feelings of injustice. Paranoia, they're out to get me. They feel persecuted. They're overly sensitive. I've even heard self-destructive tendencies. People make comments about killing themselves, and it's not taken seriously. Well, that's not a comment that most people make. It may be a silent cry for help. The bottom line is, are other workers afraid of this individual, whether it's calls, harassment, emails, aggression? That fear needs to be stricken from your workplace. That's what it revolves around. So these are the behavioral warning signs that all of your employees need to be alert for and be reporting. So who do they report it to? Via their supervisors and via the discrete reporting channels, it should end up with the case management team. After a preliminary investigation, if there's some substance to the report, then it should have the benefit of that collective wisdom I keep talking about, and that's your case management team. And the objective here is to come up with the best solution for both the individual and for the organization. The participants on this team, and they vary, but usually it's representation from HR, from security, a senior management level person, someone from legal, and any department that the particular person is occupying, that supervisor. There can be others, but these are the major, I would say, essential components to that case management team. Plus, another essential component is the outside assistance, whether that's a clinical psychologist, whether that's a security consultant who specializes in this, or whether that's perhaps even law enforcement if there's been some suggested criminal activity. Now you are getting to what the best solution for the organization is and for the individual. Because it could be this individual just is looking for help. And what's the best disposition for this case? And obviously it's the responsibility of this case management team from the initial report on for documentation. And that means all meetings, all individual reports, all interviews, all actions, documentation of the actions taken, of statements taken from people, etc. That all has to be centrally located and kept, because one day it may be the basis of your defense that you did do everything possible to recognize the situation and to do something about it. Now let's get into a subset of what any prevention plan should address, and that's the high-risk terminations. These can be absolutely, whether they're high risk or not, terminations are devastating to people. It is, if it's not handled with discretion, it can really have some ramifications long after they leave. Sometimes immediately after they leave, sometimes during the process of them leaving, but sometimes well after they have left. Your objective here is to keep them from being so fixated on your company as the reason for their demise that they are bent on coming back for revenge. And there are some ways, some protocols to keep that from happening, or at least to increase the chances that they will leave knowing that they were at least treated fairly, given every opportunity to correct their behavior, and it was brought on by them. First of all, again, human resources and security must work together. They have to first address the immediate security concerns. If there's been an altercation, if there's been a threat, if there's been a fight, the immediate security concerns are there. So, perhaps it's removal from the workplace without terminating them. Maybe it's just getting them out, putting them on suspension, putting them on leave, whether it's paid or not, getting them out of the workplace so that you can do a complete investigation and you can get to the facts. And more than that, you can get to the history behind some of the facts. So after you get that preliminary risk or incident assessment, it gives you time to assess the case. It gives you time to have the case management team assemble all the facts and the history and get the opinions of the third parties, professionals, as to whether this is a serious problem, whether it can be remedied with counseling, whether it's somebody that needs some EAP assistance for a substance or a marital situation or whatever it is, or is this something that, well, eventually we're going to have to terminate because they haven't turned their behavior around. This seems to be a developmental occurrence. We've given them one warning already. They're not responding, and it's time to terminate. So, and remember, termination is not the end of the process. It has to be done in a manner, and again, I don't want to get too deeply into this, but thinking through the termination logistics, once you've decided that's the right course of action, is when are we going to do it? Where are we going to do it physically in the building? Who will be doing that? What team is going to to conduct the interview? What's the pathway literally out of the building? We want to have no goodbyes. It's got to be immediate exit, discreetly but swiftly, and those kind of things, all of which were covered in our last webinar. But that is not a simple process to work through. But if you don't work through it well and give the person opportunity to save face as much as they can in this situation, it may come back to haunt you. And then there's those post-termination concerns. One of the advantages of that third-party consultant, that third party, whether it's a clinical psychologist or a third-party assistant of some type, is that should be the person who kind of stays in touch with your former employee and sees if they are getting on with their life, see if they're moving on, and if they're not just fixated, especially at pivotal dates, anniversary dates of hire or dates of fire, birthdays, particular events that are going to be significant in their life. Those are dates where it's important to check and see how this person is doing, and are they moving on in their lives. Otherwise, they might move back into yours. So the third-party assistants, I've mentioned this, professional clinical psychologists, outside security assistants, and that can be for everything from assisting you with determination in terms of standby and escort services, escorting them out of the building, continued observation around the workplace and extra security for observation posts to make sure that the person doesn't come back in a threatening manner. Extra coverage just in general afterwards. Sometimes it's even around executive residences if there's a concern there. There is a double-edged sword for some level of continuous surveillance on a subject, and that's really the kind of debatable. It's the subject of another class, but there are some good points and some bad points about that. Suffice it to say, if you decide you want to surveil this person to see if they're, moving on with their life, or to see if their first move after they left the office after the termination was to go to the bar and then go to a gun shop, well, just make sure that that surveillance is done without pinching pennies. It's done in a manner that is not going to be spotted by professionals, and I mean multiple operatives. You can't really do good surveillance with one car and one person. They're going to be spotted, and if this person is already irritated at you and has some sense of paranoia, now they're being followed, that is not going to leave them feeling good about your organization at all. It's going to make matters worse. So if you decide surveillance is a necessary thing, make sure it's done by professionals and that it's done in a manner that's not going to be spotted. And I mean, that's going to take multiple people and multiple cars to do it well, and to do it in a discreet manner so that they aren't spotted, because it's not as easy as it is on television. It could be that you have to have some social media monitoring. That can be done rather discreetly, and that can be a form of threat assessment, a pretty effective one, because it's amazing what people will do and say on social media that they wouldn't do in public, or wouldn't say in public, or even in a private conversation. It just never ceases to amaze me what they'll post, and there can be a lot of intelligence gleaned from that. Perhaps there's employee counseling, EAPs. Now, when I say outplacement assistance, what I mean by that is not recommending them for other jobs, because I've talked to a lot of HR people that say, hey, look, we fired this person because they were a problem in the workplace. They were disproportionately aggressive. They were violent, and we felt that they needed to be removed from our workplace. Why should I recommend them? I can't do that to someone else. Well, this isn't recommending. This is helping them through a process of finding another job, just the mechanics of it. Not recommendation, but outplacement assistance. And that's a different thing. But it does help them move on, and that's what you want them to do. And as I said, that professional assistant can now give you that follow-up consultation, can kind of keep tabs on this person, and are they moving on with their life without that being somebody from your company doing it. Now let's talk about proactive matters. We've got about 15 minutes left, so let's wind down. But there are some proactive measures and some response things that you should plan for. Obviously, we've talked about employee reporting channels. For someone wanting to report something about themselves, that they need help, it should be an open, welcoming type of a channel. For someone reporting things about others, then that needs to be more on the discreet side, because fear and intimidation is a very real thing in these cases, and you don't want to discourage people from reporting just because they're afraid. So they have to be, it has to be a discreet channel. Now you cannot, that being said, you cannot guarantee absolute confidentiality. If this eventually goes to court, you may have to have them testify, but you can at least be discreet in the initial phases of it and disguise who's making the reporting. There's customer service personnel training. If you have personnel that frequently have to engage with people like this, some type of nonviolent confrontation management course, one that talks about verbal de-escalation, nonverbal de-escalation. How do you engage with someone who's irritated and talk them down and get them to calm down and prove to them you're just trying to help them? This kind of training is important, and it can affect whether you end up having workplace violence situations that are born of this kind of customer service practice. EAPs, external experts, we've already talked about that. Sometimes just employee counseling for the purpose of doing nothing more valuable than just listening. I've talked to a lot of these clinical psychologists that we work with in some of these cases, and many of them say, look, often these people just want someone to listen to them. They just want somebody to hear them out and hear their side, whether it's right or wrong. They just want to be heard. So that can help. Let's look at some of these. First, remember I said we have external source workplace violence and internal. Let's look at the external first, whether it's criminal activity from a non-employee or customer, or whether it's customer or client related violence. Some of the things on the reactive or the preventive side that you can do is a facility security audit. Or do you have a safe enough work environment given the conditions in your business, given the conditions in the neighborhood? Do you have a secure enough facility for people to work within and feel safe? And that takes into account doing crime statistics, working with the local police on what kind of a neighborhood do you really occupy? Do you have a history of incidents in your industry, or more specifically, at your facility? Is there a history of incidents at other facilities in your company that may spill over into your facility? Have you developed those employee reporting channels? Do you have customer service personnel go through training like I just described, the de-escalation type training that gives them some tools to operate with to calm situations down? General security awareness. Do people understand what the workplace violence policy is? And again, do they know what those behavioral red flags are? What to report and who to report it to? Have you established police liaison? And this can be valuable in a number of different areas for intelligence, as well as they should know where your building is. They should know some of you. They should have some rapport with you. You shouldn't be afraid to call them if you need an extra drive-by patrol once in a while because of a particular condition in your building. If you've had a high-risk termination, perhaps they can assist you. Perhaps they can to let you know what different cars they operate. They can let you know if they have gun permits. They can let you know a number of things, but they aren't going to if you don't have a relationship with them as a trusted employer in the area. So these are some proactive and response-driven things that you can do to help to build your doing the right thing for your employees and your defense. The other thing you can do in terms of establishing police liaison, and I'll mention it because I'm going to mention it again, is the police should not, if they're called to your building, it should never be the first time they come there. You should invite them in to do a tour of the building, maybe under the guise of having them, they're always looking for places to train. Let them do some training in your building. We'll talk about active shooter a little bit here in a few minutes, and that's one very valuable scenario that they could train on in your building so that if it ever happened, they're more familiar with your facility. So those types of things help to build that rapport. So from an internal source defense, and that, remember, those are the employee to employee, the domestic spillover, or the termination related incidents. First of all the employees need to understand the workplace violence prevention policy. Again, you have to have the reporting required discrete channels. There should be complete investigations of reports. Don't just sweep them under the rug. Don't say, well, that's just the way old Joe is. Just ignore him. Those things have to be reported. Those things have to be investigated, and they have to be addressed with old Joe. Employee counseling, EAP experts, we talked about this. Specific case assessment process. It is a process. It's not just sitting around the table, well, what do you guys think we should do? It goes through the process of seeking other opinions and doing the investigation, seeking a history, looking into this person's background, all of that to make a good determination about the case. If termination is decided that is going to be the appropriate disposition for this case, then you follow the protocols and you follow the guidance and the recommended procedures for exiting this person with as much discretion and saving as much face for them as you can. Because though you might not want to, though they may richly deserve to be terminated, you want to reduce the possibility of them coming back for revenge by treating them as fairly as possible. Remember that. Now, active shooter response. It's unfortunate, but that seems to be lately the most serious manifestation of this workplace violence phenomenon. So let's take a moment and talk about active shooter and what you should have in terms of your organization. This is the most violent, the most lethal, the most threatening condition of workplace violence that you can have. These are often driven by all those things we've talked about, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they kind of act, you're just a victim of circumstance. So you've done everything you could to prevent or recognize a developing situation, but geez, what do you do now if you do have somebody in your facility with a gun and they're just going through the facility shooting people? That's what an active shooter is. It's not a robbery. It's not a hostage taking. It's not a crime gone bad and then they're trying to get away. Most active shooters, in the purest sense, don't try to get away. Most active shooters come in with a particular target in mind or targets, and then they're just randomly shooting people until they either run out of ammunition or they kill themselves, or the police come in and apply lethal force to end the situation. The police or an armed security officer or some other person that can confront them with deadly force. That's typically how these things end. Rarely, sometimes they'll leave the facility and get away. There have been cases like that, but most often it's murder-suicide, multiple murder and suicide. So they have different motivations. That drives different tactics, and that tactic makes it a very unique condition for those that respond. Active shooter is the most lethal situation a police officer can get into. And again, I don't have the time because we're at about our last 5 to 7 minutes. I don't want to get into this being a total active shooter response course, but I will tell you that law enforcement conditions and law enforcement protocols have changed since the Columbine incident. And in that particular response, the high school at Columbine the Columbine High School was surrounded. The perimeter was secured, and they waited for SWAT to arrive, and subsequent investigation learned that, and that was protocol to that point. Subsequent investigation learned that there were lives that were lost as the policemen were just around the building securing it, waiting on SWAT. So from that point on, the whole paradigm shift in law enforcement went to, we're going to respond, and the first or second officers on the scene, some departments have a 2-officer rule, they will go in and immediately look for the shooter and try to eliminate the threat. They aren't going to wait for the tactical teams anymore because they don't have time. People are being shot as they're waiting. So they will be going in. And the result of that, I will tell you, being former law enforcement myself, are nervous patrolmen doing the most lethal thing they can do going through your building. And that is looking for someone who is actively shooting people and will shoot them with absolutely zero hesitation. And there are a lot of dynamics that drive this, but it's a dangerous condition for everyone. So your occupants, your employees, and I say occupants because it might not all be your employees. Could be customers, could be visitors, but your occupants need to be told what to do. The basic premise of any of these active shooter response plans that I've seen, those that I teach as well as those that I've gone to and experienced, it's all based on the premise of whatever terminology you use, whether it's run, hide, fight, or whether it's get out, hide out, or take out. It's first you escape. First you get out of the building as quickly and as carefully, I say quickly and carefully, as possible. You never want to pull the fire alarm in an active shooter incident because, first of all, fire alarms are often ignored. And secondly, that just means people kind of haphazardly walk out and they're not really looking ahead of them because there's no danger. They're just getting out of the building. But here, danger may lurk around every corner, may lurk on that path that you use as your exit path. So you have to be exiting quickly but safely. The hideout part is only if you're trapped. You're only going to hide if you can't get out because your only way of getting out is blocked by the shooter. And then you have to hide in an area where you can hide and create the illusion you're not there and be as quiet as possible. Now that's only a temporary condition, hopefully, because as the shooter progresses, perhaps that hideout could turn back into an escape opportunity as the shooter may progress past you. And finally, as you're hiding out, if you're trapped in a room and the shooting is right outside the door, and all of a sudden the shooter's trying to get into that space, now you're preparing for that fight of your life where you may have to take out the subject. Again, I don't want to turn this into an active shooter response plan, but these are the three conditions. These are the only three options you have. And the last two aren't very good. The first option is what everybody wants to do and what you need to communicate to your occupants. Now, there's got to be redundant communications in any response plan. And what I mean by redundant is you use several channels of communication to get the word out to two groups. Your building occupants as to what's going on in plain language and what they're to do. And secondly, it goes to 911, it goes to the police, because they're the ones that are going to come in and hopefully bring this condition to a resolution, maybe not peaceful, but at least bring it to a stop. So that has to be redundant communication and simultaneous, giving early warning and direction to the occupants as what to do. And there has to be specific evacuation protocols that are specific to the event and, more importantly, specific to your facility. A response plan is much different for a school, for example, than it is for a factory or for an office setting. So the plan has to be specific to your environment. Finally, documentation of the process. That's important for all the process, the meetings, the actions, the reports. It protects the integrity of your information. It protects somewhat confidentiality. It provides you legal protection and perhaps even help for the individual. I mentioned that I would share a training resource. I need to share that our website for training courses related to workplace violence, you see them all listed, is IMAC-training, very easy to remember, IMAC-training.com. Lastly, I will open up to questions, and I will tell you that if you email me with your contact information from your business address, I will send you copies of these slides. So now I'll open it up for questions, and we'll go at it. If you have any questions, just type them in. Any questions at all? Doesn't look like we have any being submitted, so I will assume that things were relatively clear. As I said, if you send me an email, I will share these slides with you. Otherwise, we've reached the end of our session. If there are no questions and I still don't see any, I'll sign off. So have a good day, and thank you for joining us.